I heard Milo yelp, and my stomach dropped before I reached the back door. He was on the ground near the fence, his body shaking in hard, violent spasms. I ran to him and dropped to my knees, pulling him close. Foam was spilling from his mouth. His legs twitched. His eyes found mine wide, confused, begging me to make it stop. I screamed for help until my voice cracked. Across the fence, a door opened slowly. Gary Sutton stepped off his porch, hands in his pockets, and stood there watching. Not alarmed. Not shocked. Just quiet and still. Like someone who already knew how this would end. "Please," I screamed. "Something is wrong with my dog. Help me." He tilted his head. "Should have kept it away from my yard." I went cold all over. Milo shuddered once. Then he was still in my arms. "My name is Dana Caldwell. I was 29 years old, renting a small house on Birch Street in Clover Falls, Ohio. The day Gary Sutton killed my dog was the day I stopped being a quiet, compliant neighbor and started becoming the most dangerous thing he had ever underestimated. Most people grieve a pet and move on. I understood that. But Milo was not just a dog to me. He was the only living thing left in my life that loved me without conditions. 14 months earlier, my father had passed away and left behind a house and a modest savings account. Before we had even finished grieving, my older brother Brian had moved in lawyers and distant relatives I barely recognized. He accused me of manipulating our father during his final months. He pushed paperwork in front of people and told them I was unstable. Then, quietly and deliberately, he cut me out of everything. I walked away with almost nothing. No house. No family. No real sense of who I was anymore. Milo had been there through every sleepless night that followed. Every morning I wasn't sure I could get up. Every moment I felt like I was standing at the edge of something I couldn't name. He was 3 years old, golden-furred, and the most loyal creature I had ever known. Now he was gone because the man next door couldn't stand the sound of barking. That knowledge didn't break me. It hardened me into something else entirely. I drove to the police station that same evening with shaking hands and dried tears on my face. The officer at the front desk, a tired-looking man named Officer Pruitt, listened to me for about 4 minutes before his eyes started drifting past my shoulder. I told him everything. Gary's reaction at the fence. His words. The way he had watched Milo die without a single sign of surprise. Officer Pruitt tapped his pen against the desk. "Do you have any direct evidence?" he asked. "His behavior," I said. He wasn't surprised. "He told me I should have kept Milo away from his yard." "That's not evidence, ma'am." "He poisoned my dog." "That's a serious claim. We'd need a substance, a witness, something physical to go on." I had none of those things yet. He slid a form across the desk. "Fill this out and we'll follow up." His tone told me exactly what following up would look like. I drove home alone. Milo's leash was still hanging by the front door. I couldn't make myself take it down. 3 days after Milo died, I walked back to Gary's fence. Not to cry. Not to beg. I went to look at him clearly, to understand what kind of man I was dealing with before I decided my next move. He was trimming his hedges when I came over. He didn't stop working when he saw me approaching. "You killed my dog," I said. "I want you to know that I know it." He set down his clippers and turned slowly. He wasn't angry. He wasn't nervous. He looked almost faintly amused. A small, controlled smile settled at the corner of his mouth. "You're a grieving woman making accusations," he said calmly. "That's understandable. I will prove it," I told him. The smile didn't move. "People say that," he replied. "You can't prove what didn't happen." He picked up his clippers and turned back to the hedge. I walked home with that smile burned into my memory. He wasn't afraid of me. He wasn't even slightly worried. That told me he had experience getting away with things. It also told me I needed to be smarter than I had ever been in my life. I couldn't sleep the night after our confrontation. I lay on my blanket staring at the ceiling, listening to the street outside. Clover Falls was always quiet after 10 o'clock, mostly families and retired couples who turned in early. But around midnight I heard an engine. I went to the window and stood carefully behind the curtain. A dark, unmarked van had stopped in front of Gary's house. No company logo. No delivery markings. Just a plain vehicle with its headlights already off. Two men climbed out and moved quickly, carrying flat cardboard boxes from the van directly into Gary's garage. Gary stood at the garage door, checking the street in both directions before waving them through. The whole exchange lasted less than 8 minutes. Then the van was gone. The street went quiet again. I stood at the window long after that. Gary was not the kind of man who received midnight deliveries from unmarked vehicles for ordinary reasons. Something was happening in that house next door that no one else on Birch Street seemed to notice. I started noticing. The next morning, I was pulling weeds along my front path when I spotted it. A small black device was mounted near the base of Gary's gatepost, almost completely hidden behind a cluster of overgrown ivy. First I thought it was a gate sensor. But the angle was wrong. It wasn't pointing at his driveway. It was pointing directly at my yard. I stood up slowly, careful not to stare at it too long. I went inside, sat at my kitchen table, and thought carefully about what that meant. Gary had a camera aimed at my property, possibly long before Milo ever died. That meant he had been watching my yard on purpose. He had known Milo's habits. He had known exactly when Milo went near the fence and when he didn't. He hadn't acted on impulse. He had planned it. My hands gripped the edge of the table. The anger I felt wasn't the hot, helpless kind I'd had at the fence. It was cold, focused, the kind that doesn't burn itself out, the kind that gets to work. My brother Brian called that Thursday afternoon. I almost didn't pick up. Brian and I hadn't spoken since the estate dispute ended, and our last real conversation had been short and cruel on his side. But I answered because part of me still hoped he was calling to check on me. He wasn't. "Dana," he said, skipping any greeting. "I heard you've been going around making accusations against your neighbor, bothering people on your street, talking to police." I blinked. "My dog was poisoned, Brian. You don't know that. The vet. Dogs eat things they shouldn't." He cut me off. "You always do this. You turn small problems into battles and drag everyone around you into them." He exhaled sharply. "I'm asking you as your brother to let this go before you embarrass yourself." I held the phone quietly for a moment. "He's going to wish you had called to warn him instead," I said. Brian hung up. I set my phone face down on the counter and got back to work. I began retracing Milo's last hour with careful attention. He always stayed near the flower beds on my side of the yard. He almost never went close to the fence on Gary's side. The hedge was thick and dense, and Milo had never liked the smell of it. But on the day he died, he had run straight to the corner post near Gary's property line. Something had drawn him there. 2 weeks after Milo passed, I put on rubber gloves and searched that corner carefully. The grass was slightly pressed down near the base of the post, as if something had rested there recently and been removed. Wedged into the dirt beneath it was a small dried piece of meat. I photographed it from every angle before I touched it. Then I sealed it in a plastic bag and labeled it with the date. My hands were completely steady. I drove directly to the vet's office. This was no longer grief. This was evidence. And I was treating it that way from here on. Dr. Eleanor Hatch ran a full toxicology screening on the sample I brought in. She called me 48 hours later. Her voice was careful and measured, the tone of someone choosing every word precisely. "There is a compound in this sample consistent with what I found in Milo's system," she told me. "It is a toxin used in certain industrial pest controls. It is not something an animal stumbles across naturally. It has to be placed deliberately. Can you document that in writing?" I asked. "Yes, I can put it in a formal report." "Would that be enough for the police to act?" A pause. "That would be their decision. My report proves the toxin was present. Proving who placed it there is a separate matter." I thanked her and requested the written report immediately. When I brought it back to Officer Pruitt, he told me the case was being considered. His face said nothing of the kind. Whatever justice waited at the end of this road, it was becoming clearer every day that I would have to be the one to build the path there. I began having quiet conversations with my neighbors, brief stops at mailboxes, casual chats across driveways. Nothing dramatic, just careful listening. What I found turned my stomach. Carol, a woman 2 houses down, had lost her cat 8 months earlier. The cat had wandered briefly into Gary's yard and returned home sick. It died within a day. Carol had filed a report. Nothing came of it. An older man named Ted, who lived across the street, had found his small terrier unconscious near his back gate, on the side that bordered an alley running behind Gary's property. The dog survived but never fully recovered. Ted had always believed the dog had eaten something off the street. He had never once considered that someone might have put it there. I wrote down every name, date, and detail. 3 animals. 3 different households. The same symptoms. The same closeness to Gary Sutton's property. No one had connected them before because each report had been filed alone. But it was not random. It was a deliberate pattern. And it had been going on long before Milo died. On a Tuesday night, I followed the van. I had been watching for it every night since the first sighting. It came every 10 to 12 days, always after midnight, always with its headlights already off as it turned onto Birch Street. That night, I was already in my car parked half a block away before it arrived. I kept my lights off and followed at a careful distance as it crossed 2 main roads and moved toward the east side of town. It stopped at a self-storage facility called River Run Storage. I parked across the street and watched through my windshield. The men carried flat cardboard boxes through a side gate secured by a keypad. From where I sat, I could clearly see which numbers they pressed. I wrote the code down. I photographed the van's license plates, the facility sign, and the men's faces as best I could in the poor light. Then I drove home. Something important was inside that facility. And I was almost certain that Gary Sutton's real name was attached to none of it. 2 days later, I walked into River Run Storage dressed plainly, carrying a small notebook. I told the young man at the front desk that I was trying to locate a unit my uncle had rented and had lost the paperwork for. I gave him the unit number I had recorded. He typed it in without hesitation. "That unit is registered to a Thomas Weller," he said. "Thomas Weller," I repeated, writing it down as though it sounded familiar. "Yes, that must be right." I left before he could ask more questions. That evening, I searched Thomas Weller in every public database I could access freely. There was a Thomas Weller on record in the county. His listed address was in Clover Falls. His birth year placed him in his early 60s. Gary Sutton was in his early 50s. They were not the same person. But Gary was operating under that man's name. I was almost certain of it. The question that kept me awake that night was straightforward and unsettling. How many other names was he using? Once I had a false name, I had a thread to pull. I contacted a college friend who worked in financial compliance. Without sharing many details, I asked if she could search for any business registrations linked to the name Thomas Weller in the state of Ohio. What she emailed me 2 days later made me sit down hard. Thomas Weller was listed as the director of 3 separate LLCs, all registered within the last 4 years. Each one had a clean, professional-sounding business name, but no website, no physical address, and no employees that could be verified. Money flowed in from multiple sources and moved quickly through the accounts before disappearing into other channels. Total transactions across those 3 accounts over 3 years, just over $2 million. The structure was deliberately layered, complex enough to confuse most people who looked at it. But I had spent months watching lawyers move my family's money through similar arrangements during Brian's estate dispute. I knew exactly what I was looking at. Gary Sutton was not just a cruel man who poisoned dogs. He was running a serious financial fraud operation, quietly, patiently, for years. Gary caught me watching him from my window on a Saturday afternoon. I hadn't realized how visible I was until I noticed him standing perfectly still on his front path, looking directly at my face through the glass. Our eyes met. I held his gaze for a slow count of 5. Then I let the curtain fall. That evening he came to my front door for the first time. I opened it but kept the screen door latched. "Evening, Dana," he said. His voice was warm and easy, almost neighborly. He wore the same small, controlled smile I had seen at the hedge. "Gary," I replied. "I think there's been some tension between us," he said pleasantly. "I just wanted to suggest, it might be better for both of us if you focused on your own life and stopped paying so much attention to mine." He wasn't raising his voice. He wasn't making any specific threat. But beneath the pleasant words sat something cold and final. "I appreciate the visit," I said. I closed the door, locked it, and stood quietly in my hallway until my heartbeat steadied. For nights after Gary's visit, I woke up at 2 in the morning to a sound I couldn't immediately place. A slow, careful clicking at my back door. I lay completely still in the dark and listened. It came again, patient and quiet, like someone testing the lock without wanting to be heard. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand without turning on any lights and opened the camera app, pulling up the feed from the security camera I had installed above my back door the week before. On the small screen, a figure in a dark jacket crouched at my back door, working at the handle with something thin. I called 911 immediately, keeping my voice low. By the time officers arrived, the figure was gone. No damage to the lock. No one found in the area. The responding officer suggested it may have been a random attempted break-in. I did not believe that for a single second. I wedged chairs under both door handles and barely slept the rest of that night. But I did not stop working. June Harlow knocked on my door on a gray Wednesday morning. She lived 4 houses up the street, a quiet woman in her late 50s with a small garden and a friendly wave whenever we passed. I had spoken briefly to her during my neighborhood conversations, but she hadn't offered much at the time. Now she stood on my porch holding a small notebook. "I've been thinking about what you told me," she said. "About your dog." I stepped back. "Please come in." She sat at my kitchen table and told me that her cat, a 12-year-old tabby named Ginger, had died 7 months ago. Ginger had been perfectly healthy all her life. She had simply gone stiff one afternoon and passed before June could reach the vet. She had been near Gary's fence the day before, June said quietly. She slid her notebook toward me. She had written down dates, Ginger's symptoms, and her own private suspicions, all recorded in careful, neat handwriting over several months. She had been tracking it on her own without telling anyone. "I thought I was imagining things," she said softly. "But I wasn't, was I?" "No," I told her. "You weren't." Brian drove to my house on a Friday evening without calling first. I watched him park from the window before I opened the door. He had the look he always wore when he had already decided what was best for everyone, and was coming to deliver the news. He walked straight into my living room, looked at the kitchen table covered in printed documents and organized folders, and turned to face me with an expression somewhere between disbelief and contempt. "What is all of this?" "Research," I said. "I've been hearing things," he said tightly. "People I know are aware that someone named Gary Sutton is being looked into. His lawyer has apparently been reaching out to people in this county. Your name keeps coming up." I said nothing. "You are embarrassing our family," Brian continued. "You are making yourself look unstable. I am asking you for the very last time to stop before this gets worse for you." I looked at my brother for a quiet moment. "Who told Gary that someone was asking questions about him?" I asked. Brian didn't answer. He left without another word. After Brian's visit, I worked harder than before. I organized everything into 3 separate folders. The first held the medical evidence, Dr. Hatch's toxicology report on Milo, documentation of the laced meat sample recovered from the fence post, and the written accounts from Carol, Ted, and June regarding their own animals. The second held the financial thread, the LLC registrations under the Thomas Weller name, the account transaction records my college friend had located, and my photographs of the van, the storage facility, and the men who operated it. The third held a full month-by-month timeline, a precise record of Gary's behavior from the night Milo died through the attempted break-in. Every date was noted, every detail verified before it was written down. Taken separately, each piece of evidence was suggestive. Taken together, they told a complete and specific story that was very hard to argue against. I spent 3 nights cross-checking every detail for anything inconsistent. I found a few small gaps and went back to fill them properly. I was not going to give anyone a reason to dismiss what I had built. I had been debating for weeks between returning to the police and choosing a different route entirely. Officer Pruitt had already shown me what the police would do with my information. What I needed was someone who could make it impossible to ignore once it was out in the open. I contacted Mike Staton anonymously. Mike was an investigative reporter at the Clover Falls Courier. 2 years earlier, he had broken an insurance fraud story that had led to real criminal convictions in the county. He was not the kind of journalist who buried hard stories quietly. I emailed him from a private account I created just for this purpose. I described the broad outline. A local resident operating under false identities, moving large sums through shell companies, and receiving regular late-night deliveries to a private storage unit. I kept both my name and Gary's out of the message entirely. Not yet. He replied within 6 hours. Tell me more. I'm listening. Those 4 words were the first moment since Milo died that the weight on my chest shifted even slightly. I wrote back that same night and told Mike everything I had. Mike and I met in person at a coffee shop 3 towns over 2 weeks later. I brought copies of everything, the vet reports, the financial records, the full timeline, and all of the photographs. He sat across from me and read through each document with quiet, focused attention. He asked precise questions. He didn't react dramatically to any of it. He kept reading and writing in a small spiral notebook until he had gone through everything twice. When he finally set down his pen, he looked up at me. "This is significant," he said. "The identity fraud alone is serious. The financial structure, if these accounts are what they appear to be, we're talking wire fraud at minimum. Possibly much more." "What about the animal poisoning?" I asked. "It's part of the story," he said carefully. "But what forces authorities to act is the financial crime. The scale of it. That is what makes this impossible for anyone to set aside." He needed 2 more weeks to independently verify everything before publishing. I drove home that afternoon feeling steadier than I had in months. The case I had built quietly in my kitchen was about to step into the light. While Mike worked on verifying the story, Gary started coming apart at the edges. I noticed it in small ways first. The van did not arrive that month on its usual schedule. I watched Gary make 3 back-to-back phone calls from his front driveway one afternoon, pacing with his hand pressed against his forehead. His curtains, which were normally open during the day, stayed shut for long stretches of time. Then one morning, 2 men in dark suits arrived at his front door. They did not look like friends or contractors. Gary let them in quickly and shut the door. They stayed inside for nearly 45 minutes. I photographed all of it and forwarded everything to Mike. "Someone is already moving," Mike messaged back. "Federal financial crimes investigators have been monitoring activity linked to one of those LLC accounts for some time. Your information appears to have accelerated their timeline." I read that message 3 times. Gary had no idea the walls were closing in from multiple directions at once. He thought his only problem was a grieving woman on Birch Street with a notebook full of suspicions. He had no idea what was actually coming. The story published on a Thursday morning. Mike's article ran in the Clover Falls Courier's online edition first. By noon, 2 regional news networks had picked it up. By evening, it was circulating widely on financial crime news feeds and national aggregators. The headline read, "Local man operating $2 million fraud network under stolen identities. Authorities confirm investigation." Gary Sutton's photograph was in the article. So were his aliases, Thomas Weller and 2 others Mike had uncovered independently during his verification period. The shell companies were named. The storage facility was named. The total value of funds moved through the accounts was confirmed by federal sources Mike had developed over years of reporting. My name was not in the article. At my request, I was described only as a neighbor who first raised concerns. I sat at my kitchen table and read the article 4 times. Then I made a cup of coffee, stood at my back window, and looked out at the yard where Milo used to run circles in the morning sun. It wasn't over yet. But something had cracked open that could never be sealed again. The response was fast and absolute. By Friday morning, 2 federal vehicles were parked in Gary's driveway. Officers moved through his house with calm efficiency, carrying out hard drives, stacked documents, and equipment I couldn't identify from my window. A second team drove directly to River Run Storage with a court order already signed. Gary was walked out of his house in handcuffs just after 10 o'clock. He didn't look threatening as they brought him to the car. He looked small and pale, like a man who had spent so long believing he was untouchable that he had genuinely never thought to prepare for this moment. His accounts, all of them, including those connected to his aliases, were frozen. The storage units were sealed. A federal hold was placed on every asset linked to the 3 LLC companies. By that afternoon, authorities confirmed the seized units contained illegal imported goods sold fraudulently through the shell companies, a scheme that had been running for nearly 5 years. Everything Gary Sutton had built, every identity he had hidden behind, collapsed within 72 hours of that article going live. Gary was released on bail 2 weeks later pending trial. I had known he would come to the fence. I had already decided how I would respond. He looked nothing like the man who had stood there watching Milo die. He was unshaved and hollow-eyed. The controlled posture was completely gone. He looked like someone who had finally run out of moves and was only now grasping what that truly meant. "You did this," he said. His voice was flat and stripped of its old smoothness. "You ruined everything I spent years building." I looked at him steadily. "I found what was already there. That's all I did. I had a working system," he said, almost to himself. "Years of careful work. You were just a neighbor. A nobody." "I know," I said. "That was your mistake." He seemed to be waiting for something more. A triumphant moment, a final speech. I didn't give him one. "You poisoned my dog, Gary," I said quietly. Everything that followed was the consequence of that one decision. "You made it. Not me." I turned and walked back inside. I was done looking at Gary Sutton. Brian called 6 weeks after Gary's arrest. His voice was different, quieter, stripped of the authority he always carried. He had seen the news coverage. He understood now what I had done and what it had taken to do it. "I owe you an apology," he said. "For Dad's estate. For telling you to stop. For all of it." I let him finish without interrupting. "I appreciate that," I told him. "And I meant it." "Does that mean we can?" "It means I appreciate it," I said gently. "That's where we are right now." I wasn't cruel. But I wasn't ready to move forward as though the past had simply dissolved. Some things take more than a phone call to repair. Some doors can open again, but only slowly and only on honest ground. I hung up and sat quietly in my kitchen for a while. June had brought flowers to my door that week. Mike had sent a kind note after the article won a regional journalism award. Gary's trial was set for the following spring, and federal prosecutors were confident. I still kept Milo's leash hanging by the front door. Not because I was stuck in grief, but because he was the reason I had discovered what I was truly made of. And I never wanted to forget that.